England, 1813. The golden light of autumn filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Manor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Flora Ashford, Duchess of Westmere, stood alone in the grand entrance hall, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on a letter that had just arrived. 7 years had passed since she had accepted her fate as the wife of a man whose heart belonged to another. 7 years of silence inside a marriage that existed only on paper. "Your Grace," the butler announced with practiced formality. "His Grace the Duke has returned from London." Flora straightened at once, smoothing the front of her pale blue gown. "Thank you, Bennet. I shall greet him." The heavy oak doors opened, revealing Henry Ashford, Duke of Westmere. At 35, he remained one of the most admired men in England. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp gray eyes that rarely softened, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man used to command. His dark hair showed the first trace of silver at the temples, a mark of the weight he carried. "Your Grace," Flora said, dipping into a perfect curtsy, "I trust your journey was pleasant." Henry barely looked at her as he handed his gloves to a footman. "As well as can be expected, I have correspondence to attend to. I shall take dinner in my study." Without waiting for her reply, he passed her, his boots echoing across the marble floor. The scent of sandalwood and leather lingered behind him, the closest Flora ever came to her husband. A maid approached softly. "Your Grace, shall I have a tray prepared for you as well?" "No, Eleanor," Flora replied calmly. "I shall dine in the small sitting room." She held herself together until Henry disappeared up the staircase. Only then did her shoulders lower slightly, the careful mask slipping for just a moment. Lady Constance Harrington entered from the drawing room. At 40, with kind eyes and a steady presence, she had become Flora's closest companion. "He returns like a storm cloud," Constance said quietly. "Did he ask after you?" Flora shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "He never does. I believe he has forgotten how." 7 years is a long time to be so cold," Constance said, linking her arm with Flora's. "One might think ice runs through his veins." "It was not always so," Flora replied as they moved toward the sitting room. "Once, Henry Ashford was known for warmth and generosity. Before she betrayed him," Constance said gently, "before Elena Rutherford fled the altar and vanished with his cousin." The scandal still echoed through society. Henry had retreated from public life, only to return months later with an announcement that shocked London. He would marry Flora Hallway, the quiet daughter of the Earl of Clarendon. A practical arrangement. Her dowry for his title. "No love expected. You deserve more than this half-life," Constance said as they sat by the fire. "A duchess in name only." "I knew what I accepted," Flora replied, though the words felt thin. "My father's debts would have destroyed us. This marriage saved my family, at the cost of your happiness." Flora stared into the flames. "There are worse fates than comfort and safety, and better ones than watching your husband chase ghosts," Constance replied. The servants whisper. "They say he still searches for her." Flora's heart tightened. "What he does with his time is his affair." "And what of your life?" Constance pressed. "These are your best years." Before Flora could answer, Bennet appeared. "Your Grace, a message from Lady Hartswood. She requests your presence at tomorrow evening's dinner." Flora nodded. "Send our acceptance." Another evening of whispers, another room filled with pitying glances. Yet duty demanded attendance. Upstairs, Henry stood alone in his study staring into the fire. Another report from his investigator lay crumpled at his feet. 7 years chasing shadows. 7 years refusing to let go. His eyes drifted to a small portrait on his desk. Not of Elenina, but of his late mother. Her voice echoed in his mind. "A man is measured not by the wounds he suffers, but by how he heals." He had not healed. When his valet reminded him of Lady Hartswood's dinner, Henry agreed to attend. For once, he would not let his wife face society alone. The following evening, the Hartswood ballroom shimmered with candlelight and music. Flora entered on Henry's arm, her green gown soft against his black coat. Heads turned. Whispers followed. They looked perfect together. Only Flora felt the distance between them. As they moved through the crowd, Henry's hand settled briefly at her back. The touch startled her. "You defend my absence well," he said quietly. "It is not my place to judge your choices," Flora replied. "Is that not a wife's right?" he asked, almost wryly. "You made it clear ours was not that sort of marriage." Before he could reply, he was drawn into conversation, and Flora stood alone. Moments later, Henry returned and, to her shock, offered his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance?" They had never danced before. As they moved together, something shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but awareness. Then the doors opened. A ripple moved through the room. A woman stepped inside, dressed in crimson, her laughter carrying across the ballroom. Henry froze. Flora felt his grip tighten. "Impossible," he whispered. And in that moment, Flora knew the ghost that had haunted her marriage for 7 long years had finally returned. The music faltered for a breath as whispers raced across Lady Hartswood's ballroom. Flora felt them like cold air against her skin. Henry stood rigid beside her, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just entered, as if the past itself had taken shape before him. Elena Rutherford moved through the crowd with practiced grace, every step confident, every smile deliberate. Time had been kind to her. Her beauty had only sharpened, polished by experience and loss. She wore her widow's status like an ornament, not a wound. "Henry," Flora said quietly, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. "Perhaps we should leave." He did not look at her. "She is here," he said hollowly. "After all this time." Lady Hartswood hurried forward, her expression caught between shock and delight. "Lady Stanfield," she exclaimed. "What an unexpected pleasure." Olenina curtsied, flawless. "I hope my arrival does not disrupt your evening. My husband and I have only recently returned to England. I wish to reconnect with old friends." Her gaze slid past Lady Hartswood and landed squarely on Henry. Flora felt the air thicken. The past was no longer a ghost. It was standing before them, smiling. Henry inclined his head stiffly. "Lady Stanfield. And this must be your wife," Elena said, turning her attention to Flora. Her eyes swept over her with cool assessment. "The Duchess of Westmere." Flora met her gaze evenly. "Flora Ashford. A pleasure." Elena's smile thinned. "How fortunate." The orchestra resumed, though the music felt distant now. Guests pretended to resume their conversations, but every ear strained toward the small circle of tension. For old times' sake, Elena said softly to Henry, "Perhaps one dance to show there are no hard feelings." Flora felt something crack inside her. 7 years of silence, one brief dance she herself had only just been granted. And now this woman asked for more. "We are leaving," Flora said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Henry hesitated. The pause felt endless. "Yes," he said at last. "We are." Elena's eyes flickered with surprise, then calculation. "Another time, then. I shall be in London for the season." As Henry guided Flora away, the whispers grew louder. Outside, the night air was sharp with autumn cold. The carriage ride home passed in strained silence. "She is a widow," Henry said at last. "Yes," Flora replied. "How convenient." He looked at her sharply. "You think she has an agenda?" "I think she always has," Flora said quietly. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Henry withdrew into his study. Letters arrived for him, sealed and hidden quickly away. Flora kept the household running as always, though her nerves were stretched thin. On the 4th morning, scandal sheets arrived with the post. Society sensation. Flora read aloud to Constance, "The return of the runaway bride." Her cheeks burned, but her spine remained straight. Before Constance could respond, Mrs. Hughes entered, visibly unsettled. "Your Grace, there's a young woman requesting to see the Duke. She claims to be Mr. Stanfield's sister." Flora hesitated only a moment. "Show her in." Victoria Stanfield was young, dark-haired, and pale with worry. She spoke without preamble. "My brother did not die naturally," she said. "Elenina poisoned him." The accusation struck like thunder. Victoria produced letters, then a journal. Page by page, the truth unfolded. Illness, suspicion, fear. A slow, deliberate death. "And why bring this to us?" Flora asked. "Because she has returned for him," Victoria said, "and she will do it again." That evening, Flora placed the journal on Henry's desk. "Read," she said. Hours later, he came to her door. His face changed. Older. Worn. "Awake." "I was a fool," he said quietly. "No," Flora replied. "You were betrayed." Elena's shadow could no longer be ignored. Henry made a decision. "We must appear united," he said. "No more distance, no more rumors." "And after?" Flora asked. "We continue," he said simply. The next weeks blurred into public appearances, dinners, walks. Music. Henry's attention never left Flora's side. The Ton noticed, Elena noticed. Then came the rumors, whispered suggestions, questions of legitimacy, of untouched vows. "There is only one way to silence them," Henry said one morning. "We must make our marriage real." Flora looked at him, searching his face. Not strategy alone. Something else lived there now. "Yes," she said. Their first kiss came slowly, cautiously, as if both feared the moment might vanish. But it did not. It deepened, anchoring them to the present. And just as winter loosened its grip, Lady Hartswood's masquerade arrived. Masks, candlelight, Elena in gold. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Victoria spoke. Henry stood firm. The truth was revealed in fragments sharp enough to wound. "You will leave London," Henry said coldly, "or the world will know what you are." Elena's beauty hardened into rage. Then fear. She left before dawn. Henry found Flora at sunrise. "She is gone," he said. Flora searched his face. No longing remained. Only relief. "I wasted 7 years," he said softly. "No," Flora replied. "They led you here." He took her hand. This time it was not for show. And for the first time since her wedding day, Flora allowed herself to believe the past had finally loosened its hold. The winter had broken, but spring had only just begun. Dawn spread softly across Greystone Manor, pale light touching the frost-covered gardens. Flora stood at the window of her bedchamber, watching the world wake. For the first time in 7 years, the house no longer felt hollow. It breathed differently now, as if something long frozen had begun to move again. Henry joined her quietly, fully dressed, his presence no longer distant or guarded. "Price has confirmed it," he said. "Elena left London before sunrise. She is gone." Flora closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle. "Then it is finished?" "Yes," Henry said. "Finished." They stood together in silence, not awkward, not strained, just quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. Later that morning, Victoria Stanfield departed for the countryside under Henry's protection. As her carriage disappeared down the drive, Flora felt a sense of closure she had not known she needed. The danger had passed, but what remained was something far more uncertain. Over the following days, the Ton buzzed with speculation. Elena's sudden departure raised questions, but no one dared ask them openly. The Duke and Duchess of Westmere were seen everywhere together now. Riding in the park, dining publicly, laughing softly at private jokes no one else understood. What began as strategy no longer felt like pretense. Henry changed in ways Flora had never imagined. He lingered over breakfast, asked her thoughts, listened. He watched her as she spoke, as if learning the shape of her words. In the evenings, he sat beside her while she played the pianoforte, no longer hidden behind walls. One night, as the fire burned low, Henry spoke what had lived between them unspoken for weeks. "I have been afraid," he said. Flora looked at him. "Of what?" "Of hoping," he replied. "I lived so long inside resentment that it became familiar. Letting it go felt like stepping into darkness. You are not alone there," Flora said gently. "I learned how to survive without expectation. Hope felt dangerous." He reached for her hand. "Do you still feel that way?" She considered the question honestly. "No," she said, "not anymore." Their marriage, once an arrangement built on silence, began to fill with small truths. They spoke of childhoods, of disappointments, of moments each had endured alone while living under the same roof. There were tears, regrets, and apologies that needed no defense. One evening, Henry stopped her as she passed him in the corridor. "Flora," he said, his voice unsure, "may I ask something selfish?" She smiled softly. "You may. Will you forgive me," he asked, "for not seeing you sooner?" She searched his face, then lifted her hand to his cheek. "I already have." Winter loosened its hold on the estate. Frost melted. Buds appeared on the bare branches. With the change in season came invitations, renewed curiosity, and a shift in how society viewed the Duchess of Westmere. No longer pitied, no longer overlooked. At a spring gathering hosted by Lady Hartswood, Flora entered the ballroom on Henry's arm, her confidence unmistakable. The whispers were different now. Respect replaced speculation. Wonder replaced mockery. Henry leaned close to her as they moved among the guests. "They see you," he murmured. "At last." "They see us," Flora replied. Later that night, back at Greystone Manor, Henry paused at the door to her chamber. The door that had once marked separation now felt symbolic in a different way. "I will not assume," he said quietly. "I want you to choose this. Choose me." Flora stepped closer. "I already have." Their union, when it came, was not rushed. It was gentle, deliberate, built on trust rather than hunger. 7 years of distance melted into something tender and real. In the weeks that followed, Henry made changes that surprised even himself. He reduced his relentless work. He took Flora with him on travels. He listened when she spoke of charitable interests, then funded them without hesitation. "You move through the world differently," she observed one afternoon. "I learned from watching you," he replied. "You endured without bitterness. I want to be worthy of that." News arrived from abroad months later. Elalina had attempted to settle elsewhere, but whispers followed her. Doors closed quietly. She faded into obscurity, just another cautionary tale society would soon forget. Henry read the letter, then burned it without comment. "Do you regret it?" Flora asked. He shook his head. "I regret nothing that led me to you." Spring bloomed fully at Greystone Manor. The gardens burst with color. The house filled with warmth, laughter, and purpose. Servants noticed the change. Visitors remarked upon it. The Duke no longer dined alone. One afternoon, Flora stood in the nursery, sunlight streaming through the windows. Henry watched her from the doorway, a soft expression on his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That 7 years ago," he said, "I believed my life was over. I thought love had betrayed me beyond repair. And now," she prompted. "Now I understand," he said. "Love did not betray me. I simply placed it in the wrong hands." She turned to him. "And now?" "Now," he said, crossing the room, "it is exactly where it belongs." When summer arrived, Greystone Manor hosted its first grand celebration in years. Music drifted across the lawns. Lanterns glowed in the twilight. Guests watched as the Duke and Duchess danced beneath the open sky. No masks, no distance. Constance Harrington observed from the terrace, a satisfied smile on her face. "She waited," Constance said later, "and she was rewarded." Flora only smiled. That night, as stars filled the sky, Henry held Flora close. "I ignored you for 7 years," he said softly. "I will spend the rest of my life making amends." "You do not owe me penance," Flora replied. "Only presence." "You have it," he said. "Always." And so the marriage that had begun in silence found its voice. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, enduring, and real. The Duke had begged for her love once. Now he spent every day proving he was worthy of it.